The cold bit through Samuel Kincaid's coat like the teeth of a starving wolf, and he knew that if he didn't find shelter soon, the Wyoming Territory winter would claim him just as it had claimed so many others before him. He urged his horse forward through the mounting snowdrifts, squinting against the wind that howled across the open plains, when he saw something that made his heart stop. A dark shape half buried in white, too small to be a deer, too still to be alive. Samuel dismounted before his mind fully registered what he was doing, his boots sinking deep into the snow as he stumbled toward the figure. As he drew closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was a woman, curled on her side like a child, her dark hair spread across the snow like ink on paper. Her lips had taken on a blue tinge and frost clung to her eyelashes. He dropped to his knees beside her, pressing his fingers to her throat with hands that trembled from more than just the cold. They're faint as a whisper, but they're nonetheless a pulse. "Hold on," he said, though she couldn't hear him. "Just hold on." He shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her before lifting her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and he could feel how cold she was even through his layers of clothing. His horse whinnied nervously as he approached, but the animal held steady while Samuel carefully positioned the woman across the saddle. He climbed up behind her, pulling her against his chest and wrapping his arms around her to share what little warmth his body could provide. The line shack he'd been heading toward when the storm hit was still another mile north, and Samuel prayed it would be enough. He'd used it before during cattle drives, knew it had a stove and firewood, knew it was the only chance either of them had. He kicked his horse into motion, bending low over the woman's body to shield her from the wind. By the time the rough wooden structure came into view through the swirling snow, Samuel's muscles were screaming with exhaustion and cold. He half fell from the saddle, catching the woman before she could slide to the ground. The door of the shack wasn't locked. Nothing out here ever was, and he kicked it open, stumbling inside with his precious burden. The interior was dark and barely warmer than outside, but at least it blocked the wind. Samuel laid the woman on the single narrow cot in the corner, then turned his attention to the iron stove. His fingers were so numb he could barely strike a match, and the first 3 broke before one finally caught. He'd never been so grateful to see kindling catch fire in his life. As the flames grew, casting flickering light across the small space, Samuel got his first real look at the woman he'd rescued. She was young, probably no more than 22 or 23, with delicate features and skin that had been fair before the cold had drained it of color. Her clothes were worn but well made, a traveling dress that spoke of someone who'd started a journey with care and preparation. What had brought her out into this God-forsaken wilderness alone? He worked quickly, knowing that warming her too fast could be as dangerous as the cold itself. He removed her frozen outer garments, his movements careful and respectful, leaving her in her chemise and petticoat. He wrapped her in both of their coats and the 2 wool blankets he found in the shack's supply chest, then set about heating water in the battered kettle he found near the stove. The storm raged outside, wind howling through the cracks in the walls, but inside the shack was growing warmer. Samuel knelt beside the cot, taking one of the woman's small hands between both of his, rubbing gently to restore circulation. Her skin was like ice, and he found himself talking to her, willing her to live. "Come on now," he said softly. "You didn't survive this long just to give up. Open those eyes for me. Let me see you're still in there." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Samuel kept the fire burning hot, kept rubbing warmth into her hands and feet, kept talking to her about nothing and everything, about the ranch where he worked, about the cattle drive that had brought him north, about how his mother used to make the best apple pie in 3 counties. When her eyelids finally fluttered, he nearly shouted with relief. Her eyes were dark brown or maybe hazel. He couldn't quite tell in the firelight, and confusion swam in their depths. "Easy," Samuel said, his hand moving to her shoulder as she tried to sit up. "Easy now. You're safe. You're in a lined shack about 15 miles north of Wilson, Kansas. I found you in the snow." She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to make sense of his words. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, rough with cold and disuse. "My sister." Samuel's heart sank. "There was no one else, just you. I'm sorry." Tears spilled down her cheeks, cutting tracks through the grime on her face. "The wagon overturned. The horses ran. She told me to go for help, but I couldn't find anything. Just snow, so much snow. How long ago, I don't know. Yesterday. The day before." Everything started to blur together. Samuel squeezed her hand. "We'll look for her as soon as the storm breaks, I promise you that. But right now you need to focus on staying alive. Can you tell me your name?" "Katherine," she said. "Katherine Ellis. I'm Samuel Kincaid. Most folks call me Sam." He reached for the kettle, pouring warm water into a tin cup. "Think you can drink a little of this? You need to warm up from the inside." Katherine nodded, and Samuel helped her sit up enough to take small sips. Color was slowly returning to her face, though she still shook with cold. He wrapped the blankets more tightly around her shoulders and added more wood to the fire. "Where were you headed?" he asked, settling onto the floor beside the cot with his back against the wall. "Oregon Territory. My sister Clara and we were going to join our uncle there. He has a farm, said he could use the help now that his wife passed. Our parents died last spring fever and there was nothing left for us in Missouri." Her voice broke. Clara was all I had left. Samuel didn't offer empty platitudes about how her sister might still be alive. He'd seen enough of death in his 30 years to know that a night in this storm, injured and alone, was a death sentence. But he also knew that hope was sometimes all that kept people going. "Tell me about the wagon," he said. "Where exactly did it overturn?" Katherine closed her eyes, trying to remember. "There was a creek frozen over. The wheels hit ice and we skidded. The wagon went over on its side and I think Clara's leg was caught under something. I tried to free her, but I wasn't strong enough. She kept telling me to go to find help. I didn't want to leave her, but she wouldn't stop insisting." "You did the right thing," Samuel said, though the words felt hollow. "You can't help anyone if you freeze to death beside them." "Can you really not go look for her now?" Samuel moved to the window, peering out at the white wall of snow beyond the glass. "I'd never find her in this, and I'd likely get us both killed trying. The storm should blow through by morning. I'll head out at first light." Katherine began to cry again, quiet sobs that shook her whole body. Samuel felt helpless in the face of her grief. He'd lost people too: his father to a Comanche raid when he was 12, his brother to a stampede 3 years ago, but he'd never quite known what to say to make loss easier to bear. "I promised warmth forever," he said suddenly, the words surprising even himself. "When I found you in the snow, I made that promise. I know it doesn't mean much coming from a stranger, but I'm not going to let you freeze and I'm not going to abandon you. Whatever happens, you're not alone in this." Katherine looked at him with red-rimmed eyes, something flickering in her expression that might have been gratitude or might have been disbelief. "Why would you make such a promise to someone you don't even know?" Samuel considered the question. "Because out here, sometimes a promise is all we've got, and because no one deserves to die alone in the snow." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm. Samuel heated beans from the shack supplies and convinced Katherine to eat a little, though she had no appetite. As night fell, the temperature dropped further, and even with the fire burning, the cold seeped through the walls. "You should rest," Samuel said. "You need to rebuild your strength." "What about you?" "I'll keep the fire going. Someone needs to make sure we don't freeze. That cot is big enough for two if we're careful about it, Katherine said, her cheeks coloring despite the cold. I'm not so proper that I'd let you freeze to death for the sake of appearances. Samuel hesitated, but the practical part of him knew she was right. The temperature was still dropping, and sharing body heat might mean the difference between life and death. If you're sure, I'm sure. He lay down beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance, both of them wrapped in the blankets and coats. Even so, he could feel the heat radiating from her body, could smell the faint scent of lavender that clung to her hair despite everything she'd been through. "Sam," she said softly after a while. "Yeah, thank you for saving my life. Thank me when we find your sister." But they both knew that was unlikely, and the weight of that knowledge hung heavy in the small space between them. Samuel woke several times during the night to feed the fire, and each time he returned to the cot, Katherine seemed a little warmer, a little more alive. By the time gray light began to filter through the window, the storm had finally blown itself out, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Katherine was awake when Samuel sat up, her eyes fixed on the window. It stopped. It did. Samuel pulled on his boots, his body stiff from cold and an uncomfortable night. "I'm going to see to my horse, then I'll head out to look for your sister. You should stay here where it's warm. I'm coming with you. Katherine, she's my sister. I'm coming with you." Samuel wanted to argue, but he could see the determination in her eyes and knew it would be pointless. "Can you ride?" "Well enough." They ate a quick breakfast of hardtack and coffee, then ventured out into the transformed landscape. The world was white as far as the eye could see, the sun glinting off the snow with painful brightness. Samuel's horse had weathered the storm in the lean-to beside the shack, and though the animal was cold and hungry, it seemed sound enough. Samuel helped Katherine mount, then climbed up behind her. She directed him south, back the way she'd come, and they rode slowly through the deep snow, Katherine scanning the landscape for anything familiar. It took them nearly 2 hours to find the overturned wagon. It was partially buried in snow, lying on its side exactly as Katherine had described. Samuel dismounted and approached it carefully, already knowing what he would find. Clara Ellis had been 19 years old. She lay beside the wagon, half covered in snow, her body frozen in death. Her leg was clearly broken, bent at an unnatural angle, and Samuel could see where she'd tried to drag herself away from the wreckage before the cold had claimed her. He heard Katherine's cry of anguish behind him and turned to see her sliding from the horse, stumbling through the snow toward her sister. He caught her before she could fall, holding her as she sobbed against his chest. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "I'm so sorry." Katherine clung to him like a drowning woman, and Samuel held her, letting her grief pour out in waves. When she finally pulled back, her face was wet with tears and her eyes were hollow with loss. "We need to bury her," she said. "The ground's frozen solid. We won't be able to dig." "Then what do we do? I can't just leave her here for the wolves." Samuel thought for a moment. "There's a church in Wilson and a proper cemetery. We can wrap her in blankets, tie her to my horse. It'll be slow going, but we can get her there. Make sure she has a Christian burial." Katherine nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. Together they worked to prepare Clara's body for transport. Samuel tried to be as gentle and respectful as possible, aware of Katherine's eyes on him the whole time. When they were finished, they stood in silence for a moment, and Katherine spoke a prayer over her sister. The journey to Wilson took most of the day. The town was small, barely more than a main street with a few buildings clustered around it, but it had a church and a pastor who agreed to perform a burial service. The ground was too frozen for an immediate burial, So Clara's body was placed in the church cellar until spring thaw. "You're welcome to stay with my wife and me until you sort out what you're going to do," the pastor's wife, Mrs. Henderson, offered. She was a plump woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "It's not much, but we've got a spare room." Katherine accepted gratefully, and Samuel found himself at loose ends. He should return to the ranch where he'd been working, report back to the foreman. The cattle drive was long over, and he'd only stayed in the area to help with winter feeding. But something kept him in Wilson. He told himself it was because Katherine might need help, might need someone to look after her until she figured out her next move. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. There was something about her, a strength beneath the grief, a spark that refused to be extinguished that drew him like a moth to flame. He took a room at the boarding house and found work helping the livery owner repair storm damage. It wasn't much, but it gave him a reason to stay, and it put him in a position to check on Katherine every day. She seemed lost in those first few days, wandering through her grief like a ghost. Samuel would see her sitting in the church, staring at nothing, or walking the edges of town wrapped in a borrowed shawl. He didn't push her to talk, just made sure she knew he was there if she needed anything. It was nearly a week after Clara's funeral service that Katherine finally sought him out. Samuel was at the livery, mucking out stalls, when she appeared in the doorway like an apparition. "Sam," she said, and he was struck by how much she'd changed in just a few days. The color had returned to her face, and though grief still shadowed her eyes, there was a determination there too. "Can I talk to you, of course?" He set aside his pitchfork and wiped his hands on his trousers. "Everything all right? I've been thinking about what to do, about where to go from here." She moved closer, her hands clasped in front of her. "I have $23 to my name. That's not enough to get to Oregon, and even if it were, I'm not sure I want to go anymore. My uncle was Clara's dream more than mine. She was always the one who wanted to farm, who wanted the settled life." "What do you want?" Samuel asked. Katherine met his eyes. "I don't know. But I know I can't stay here in Wilson, living on the charity of the pastor and his wife. I need to find work, make my own way. I thought perhaps I could travel to one of the larger towns, find a position as a seamstress or a teacher. You can sew, I can, and I can read and write and cipher. Clara and I, our mother made sure we had proper schooling." Samuel nodded slowly, an idea forming in his mind. "What if I told you there might be work closer than you think? The ranch where I've been working, the Double K, they're looking for someone to help the owner's wife with household tasks. Cooking, cleaning, mending. It's not glamorous work, but it pays fair and includes room and board." Katherine's eyes widened. "Do you really think they'd hire me? Mrs. Kowalski has been complaining for months about needing help. Her husband keeps putting it off, says they can't afford it, but I know they've got the money. I could talk to them, put in a good word. Would you really do that for me?" Samuel reached out and took her hand, the gesture feeling natural despite their short acquaintance. "Katherine, I made you a promise in that line shack. I told you I'd make sure you stayed warm, that you weren't alone. I meant it then, and I mean it now." Her eyes grew bright with unshed tears. "I barely know you, and yet you've been kinder to me than people I've known my whole life. Maybe that's because I understand what it's like to lose everything, to feel like you're drifting with no anchor." He squeezed her hand gently. "Let me help you, please." Katherine nodded, a small smile breaking through her grief. "All right. Yes, thank you." 2 days later, Samuel rode out to the Double K ranch with Katherine seated behind him on his horse. The ranch was about 8 miles east of Wilson, sprawling across several hundred acres of grassland. The main house was a solid 2-story structure with a wide porch, and smoke curled from the chimney into the cold January air. Mrs. Anna Kowalski was a sturdy woman in her late 40s with work-roughened hands and a suspicious eye. She looked Katherine up and down as Samuel made introductions, her expression giving nothing away. "Samuel says you can cook and clean and so," Mrs. Kowalski said. "Yes, madam. I helped run my family's household back in Missouri. I can bake bread, preserve vegetables, butcher a chicken, and mend just about anything. Can you handle hard work, long days?" "I can." Mrs. Kowalski studied her for another long moment, then nodded. "I'll give you a trial period, 2 weeks. If you work out, the job is yours for as long as you want it. $25 a month plus room and board. You'll have Sundays off to attend church if you're so inclined." Katherine's face lit up with relief. "Thank you, Mrs. Kowalski. You won't regret this. See that I don't." Samuel helped Katherine settle into the small room off the kitchen that would be hers. It was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk for her things. Not that she had many things, just the clothes on her back and a few items salvaged from the wagon wreck. "I should get going," Samuel said, lingering in the doorway. "Let you settle in." Katherine turned to face him, and something in her expression made his heart skip. "Sam, I don't know how I'll ever repay you for everything you've done." "You don't need to repay me. Just seeing you safe and settled, that's payment enough." She crossed the small room and, to his surprise, rose on her toes to press a kiss to his cheek. "Come visit me sometime. I'd like to see you again." Samuel's face heated, and he knew he was probably red as a beet. "I'd like that too." Over the following weeks, Samuel found excuses to visit the Double K more often than strictly necessary. He'd help with repairs, check on the horses, offer to deliver supplies. And each time, he'd find a moment to talk with Katherine to see how she was settling in. She was thriving. The work was hard, but she threw herself into it with determination. And Mrs. Kowalski's suspicious manner gradually thawed into grudging approval, and then genuine affection. Katherine's grief over Clara's death still surfaced. Sometimes Samuel would catch her staring out windows with tears in her eyes, or find her sitting alone during her breaks looking lost, but she was healing. And as she healed, something was growing between them. It started with stolen glances and small smiles, with conversations that stretched longer than they needed to, with Samuel finding reasons to brush her hand or stand just a little too close. He'd been attracted to her from the start, but this was different. This was deeper. It was late February when Samuel finally gathered the courage to be honest about his feelings. He'd arranged to meet Katherine during her Sunday afternoon off, and they walked together along the creek that ran through the edge of the Double K property. The ice was beginning to break up, and the sound of running water was a promise that winter would eventually end. "Katherine," Samuel said, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "I need to tell you something." She looked at him with those dark eyes, and he saw understanding there. "I think I know what you're going to say." "You do? You're going to tell me that you have feelings for me, that these past weeks have meant something to you." She smiled softly. "And I'm going to tell you that I feel the same way." Relief flooded through Samuel so intensely it made him dizzy. "You do?" "I do. Sam, you saved my life in more ways than one. You gave me warmth when I was freezing, hope when I had none, a future when I thought I'd lost everything. How could I not develop feelings for you?" Samuel reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "I've been drawn to you since the moment I found you in that snow. Even before I saw your face, before I knew anything about you, I knew you were important." "That sounds foolish, doesn't it?" "No," Katherine whispered. "It sounds like fate." He kissed her then, soft and gentle, as if she were something precious that might break. She kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, and Samuel felt like everything in his life had been leading to this moment, When they finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily, Katherine rested her forehead against his. "What do we do now?" "Now we take things slow. Court properly. Let this grow into whatever it's meant to be." Samuel smiled. "Though I should warn you, I'm not a man of means. I'm just a ranch hand, Katherine. I don't have much to offer you. You offered me warmth and life and hope when I had nothing. That's worth more than all the money in the world." They began courting in earnest after that, within the bounds of propriety but with a growing intensity that surprised them both. Samuel would visit on Sundays, and they'd walk together or sit on the porch talking for hours. He told her about his childhood in Texas, about losing his father and brother, about the years he'd spent drifting from ranch to ranch because he couldn't bear to stay in one place too long. Katherine shared her own stories about growing up in Missouri, about her parents and the life they'd built before the fever took them, about Clara and the dreams they'd shared. She still cried sometimes when she talked about her sister, and Samuel would hold her until the tears passed. Spring came to the Wyoming territory in fits and starts, cold days giving way to warm ones and then swinging back again. The grass began to green, and the Double K prepared for calving season. Samuel threw himself into the work, proving himself valuable enough that Mr. Kowalski offered him a permanent position with a small raise in pay. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Samuel start thinking about the future in concrete terms. He began saving every penny he could spare, keeping the money in a tin buried near his bunk in the ranch hand's quarters. He had a plan forming, and though he didn't share it with anyone yet, it filled him with nervous excitement. Katherine noticed the change in him. "You've been different lately," she said one Sunday in early April as they sat together on the creek bank, watching the water rush past. "Distracted. Is something wrong?" Samuel took a deep breath. This wasn't how he'd planned to do this, but maybe there was no perfect time. "Katherine, I've been thinking about our future, about what comes next." "What do you mean?" He turned to face her fully, taking both of her hands in his. "I'm in love with you. I think I have been since the moment I found you in that snow, even if I didn't recognize it then. You're the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing on my mind before I sleep. You've changed everything for me." Tears spilled down Katherine's cheeks, but she was smiling. "Sam, I love you too, so much it scares me sometimes." "Then marry me." "I know it's fast, and I know I can't give you a fancy house or an easy life, but I can promise you warmth and love and loyalty for as long as I live. I can promise that you'll never be alone again, never have to face the cold by yourself. Marry me, Katherine, please." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you." Samuel pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the pent-up passion and love he'd been holding back. Katherine melted against him, and for a long moment, nothing existed but the two of them and the promise they'd just made. They were married in late May at the small church in Wilson, the same church where Clara's funeral service had been held. It felt right somehow, bittersweet but fitting, as if Clara's presence blessed their union. Mrs. Kowalski and several of the ranch hands attended, along with the pastor and his wife, and a handful of townspeople who'd gotten to know Katherine over the past months. Katherine wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Kowalski had helped her sew, and Samuel wore his best shirt and trousers, his hair slicked back and his boots polished. As they stood before the pastor and spoke their vows, Samuel felt a sense of rightness settle over him like a warm blanket. This was what he'd been searching for all those years of drifting. This was home. Mr. Kowalski had offered them the use of a small cabin on the edge of the ranch property, one that had been standing empty for years. It needed work. The roof leaked, the floorboards were warped, and the windows were cracked, but Samuel and Katherine threw themselves into making it livable. They worked side by side in the evenings and on Sundays, patching and painting and planning. By the time they moved in at the beginning of June, the cabin had been transformed into a cozy home. It wasn't much, just 3 rooms and a loft, but it was theirs. Their first night there, Samuel built a fire in the hearth and pulled Katherine into his arms as they stood watching the flames. "Remember when I promised you warmth forever?" he said softly. Katherine nodded against his chest. "In the line shack, when I was barely conscious. I meant it then, even though I had no right to make such a promise to a stranger, but I mean it even more now. This is our hearth, our warmth, our forever. I'll keep this fire burning for you until the day I die." "We'll keep it burning together," Katherine corrected, tilting her face up to look at him. "That's what marriage is, isn't it? Sharing the work of staying warm, of building a life." Samuel kissed her tenderly. "You're right, together." Their first year of marriage was full of hard work and simple joys. Samuel continued his work with the Double K cattle, while Katherine took in sewing and laundry from some of the neighboring ranches to earn extra money. They were building something together, slowly but surely, saving toward a future where they might buy their own small piece of land. The Wyoming winters were brutal, but Samuel made good on his promise. Their cabin was always warm, the fire always burning, blankets always ready. When the snow piled high outside and the wind howled like wolves, they would sit together by the hearth, Katherine sewing while Samuel whittled or repaired tack, and talk about their dreams. "I'd like children someday," Katherine said one evening in January, nearly a year after Samuel had found her in the snow. "Not right away, perhaps, but someday. 2 or 3, I think, enough to fill this cabin with noise and laughter." Samuel looked up from the bridle he was mending, his heart swelling. "I'd like that too, though I worry sometimes about what kind of father I'd make. My own was gone when I was so young." "You'll be wonderful," Katherine said with confidence. "You're patient and kind and steady. Those are the things that matter." "You really think so?" "I know so." She set aside her sewing and moved to sit beside him on the floor in front of the fire. "Sam, you saved my life, and then you built a life with me. You took someone who was broken and lost and helped her become whole again. If that's not the mark of a good man, I don't know what is." Samuel pulled her close, breathing in the scent of lavender that still clung to her hair. "I love you, Katherine Kincaid. I love you too." Spring brought new challenges and new opportunities. Mr. Kowalski was getting older and had been talking about selling off some of his land. Samuel approached him with a proposal. He'd worked out the numbers carefully, counted and recounted his savings. He wanted to buy 20 acres on the western edge of the property, the section with the creek running through it. "That's good land," Mr. Kowalski said, studying Samuel with shrewd eyes. "Why would I sell it to you when I could sell to someone with deeper pockets?" "Because I'll work for it. I'll pay you what I can now and the rest in installments over the next 5 years. And because you know I'll take care of it. I'll build something lasting there." Mr. Kowalski was silent for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, Kincaid, you've got yourself a deal. But I'll hold you to those payments. You won't regret this, sir." Samuel and Katherine's joy at becoming landowners was almost overwhelming. It was just 20 acres, but it was theirs. They spent every spare moment that summer working their land. Samuel built a small barn and a chicken coop, while Katherine planted a vegetable garden and tended the chickens they'd bought with some of their remaining savings. By the time autumn arrived, they had eggs to sell and vegetables to preserve for winter. It wasn't much, but it was a start. More than that, it was proof that they could build something from nothing, that the life they were creating together was real and solid. That winter, huddled together in their cabin while snow fell outside, Katherine told Samuel she was pregnant. He stared at her in shock for a moment, then let out a whoop of joy that made her laugh. He scooped her up and spun her around, both of them grinning like fools. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We're going to have a baby. We are. Come summer, we'll be parents." Samuel set her down carefully as if she might break. "Are you all right? Do you feel well? Should you be resting more?" Katherine laughed, taking his face in her hands. "I'm fine. Pregnant women don't need to be wrapped in cotton wool, but I appreciate the concern. I just want to make sure you're both safe. We will be. We have a warm home, plenty of food and each other. That's more than many people have." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter and into spring. Katherine continued her sewing work for as long as she could, and Samuel took on extra jobs to build up their savings. Mrs. Kowalski, who'd become something of a mother figure to Katherine, provided advice and hand-me-down baby clothes from her own long-grown children. On a sweltering day in July, with thunderstorms rolling across the prairie, Katherine went into labor. Samuel rode like the devil to fetch the midwife from Wilson, then spent the longest hours of his life pacing outside the cabin while Katherine labored inside. Mrs. Kowalski had come to help, and she periodically emerged to tell him everything was progressing normally, but Samuel couldn't shake his anxiety. What if something went wrong? What if he lost her? He'd found her nearly frozen to death once before and pulled her back from the brink. The thought that childbirth might take her from him was almost more than he could bear, but when the midwife finally called him inside, it was to find Katherine exhausted but beaming, a tiny bundle cradled in her arms. "Sam, meet your son." Samuel approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe. The baby was impossibly small, with a shock of dark hair and a red, wrinkled face. As Samuel watched, the infant opened his eyes and seemed to look right at him. "He's perfect," Samuel whispered, tears streaming down his face. "You're both perfect." They named him Jacob after Katherine's father. He was a healthy baby with strong lungs, and he kept them both awake many nights those first few months. But Samuel didn't mind. He would walk the floor with Jacob at 2 in the morning, singing old cowboy songs and telling him stories, while Katherine caught whatever sleep she could. Watching Katherine with their son filled Samuel with an emotion so strong it was almost painful. She was a natural mother, patient and loving and fierce in her protection. She'd lost so much: her parents, her sister, her entire former life, but she'd survived and built something new. She was the strongest person Samuel had ever known. Jacob was barely 6 months old when Katherine told Samuel she was pregnant again. This time, Samuel's reaction was more measured joy mixed with practical concern about how they'd manage with 2 little ones so close in age. But Katherine was confident, and her confidence bolstered his own. Their daughter was born the following spring on a morning when wildflowers were just beginning to bloom across the prairie. The labor was shorter this time, and Samuel was able to be present for the birth. He held Katherine's hand and whispered encouragement while she worked to bring their daughter into the world. When the baby arrived, tiny and perfect and wailing with indignation, Katherine laughed through her tears. "She's got your stubbornness already." They named her Clara, for Katherine's sister. It felt right, a way of keeping Clara's memory alive and woven into the fabric of their family. Samuel held his daughter with hands that trembled slightly, marveling at her tiny fingers and toes, at the way she fit perfectly in the crook of his arm. "Hello, little Clara," he whispered. "Welcome to the world. I promise you warmth and love and safety for as long as I live, just like I promised your mother." The years that followed were full of the organized chaos of raising small children. Jacob was walking by the time Clara was born, and he was endlessly curious about his baby sister. Samuel and Katherine worked harder than ever: the ranch, the garden, the animals, the children, but they were building something real and lasting. They added on to the cabin, creating more space for their growing family. Samuel proved to have a knack for horse training, and word spread. People began bringing him difficult horses to work with, paying decent money for his services. Catherine's sewing business also grew, and she began making quilts that she sold to the general store in Wilson. Slowly, payment by payment, they paid off the debt to Mr. Kowalski. When Samuel made the final payment in the fall of 1876, nearly 5 years after their marriage, Mr. Kowalski shook his hand firmly. "You've done well, Kincaid. Better than I expected, if I'm being honest. That land is yours, free and clear. What you build on it now, that's your legacy." Samuel felt 10 feet tall as he rode home to tell Catherine. They celebrated that night after the children were asleep, sitting by the fire that Samuel kept burning just as he'd promised, talking about the future. "We could expand," Samuel said. "Buy more land, maybe. Build up a herd of our own instead of just working other people's cattle. Or we could stay just as we are," Catherine suggested. "We have enough, Sam. Enough land, enough animals, enough work. Maybe it's time to simply enjoy what we've built instead of always striving for more." Samuel considered this. The old him, the one who'd spent years drifting from place to place, might have pushed for more, always more, trying to fill some emptiness inside. But that emptiness was gone now. Catherine and their children had filled it completely. "You're right," he said, pulling her close. "We have everything we need right here." The children grew. Jacob developed his father's love of horses and his mother's quick mind. He was reading by the age of 5, often sounding out words from the old newspapers Samuel would bring back from town. Clara was more reserved, with a streak of determination that reminded Samuel of Catherine facing down grief and loss. She adored her older brother and followed him everywhere. When Jacob was 7 and Clara was 6, Catherine became pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the first 2. She was tired more often and her back ached constantly. Samuel worried, remembering his fear during Jacob's birth, but Catherine remained calm. "I'm fine," she assured him. "Just not as young as I was the first time around." "I'll be 30 next month, Sam. That's not old, but it's not 22 either." Their third child, a boy they named Thomas, was born on a cold November morning. The birth was difficult, and for several terrifying hours, Samuel thought he might lose Catherine. But she fought her way through with the same determination she'd shown in everything else. And when it was over, they had a healthy son and Catherine was battered but alive. "No more," Samuel said firmly as he sat beside her bed, holding Thomas while Catherine rested. "We have 3 beautiful children, Catherine. That's enough. I won't risk losing you." Catherine, too exhausted to argue, simply nodded, and Samuel made sure to take precautions after that. He couldn't imagine his life without her, couldn't bear the thought of trying to raise their children alone. The years rolled by, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Jacob proved to have his father's gift with horses and began helping with the training business by the age of 12. Clara discovered a talent for healing and spent hours learning about herbs and remedies from Mrs. Kowalski, who'd learned from a Cheyenne woman years before. Thomas was still young, but he showed signs of being the scholar of the family, always asking questions about how things worked and why. Samuel and Catherine's love deepened with each passing year. They'd weathered storms, both literal and figurative, hard winters, drought summers, illness, accidents, the simple grinding work of survival. But through it all, they'd had each other. On a winter evening in 1884, nearly 10 years after Samuel had found Catherine in the snow, they sat together by the fire as they had countless times before. The children were asleep in the loft, and the cabin was warm and quiet. "You ever think about that day?" Catherine asked softly. "The day you found me," Samuel was silent for a moment, staring into the flames. "Every day. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd taken a different path, if I'd been even a few minutes later. You would have died out there in the snow. But you didn't take a different path. You found me exactly when you were supposed to." Katherine took his hand. "I used to think that day was the worst day of my life. I lost Clara, lost everything I'd thought my future would be. But it was also the day my real life began. The day I met you." "I promised you warmth forever," Samuel said, echoing words he'd spoken so many years ago. "Have I kept that promise?" Katherine leaned her head on his shoulder. "Every single day. You've given me warmth and love and a family and a home. You've given me everything." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, but inside they were warm and safe and together. The years continued to pass, bringing new challenges and joys. Jacob married at 21, bringing home a strong, capable young woman named Mary who fit seamlessly into the family. They built a small house on the edge of Samuel and Katherine's property, and Jacob expanded the horse training business into something substantial. Clara, at 19, surprised everyone by announcing she wanted to go to nursing school. There was a program in Denver that trained women as nurses, and she was determined to attend. Samuel wanted to say no, to keep his daughter safe at home, but Katherine talked him around. "She's strong and smart, and she deserves to pursue her dreams," Katherine said. "Didn't we build this life so our children could have choices? Let her go, Sam." So they did, though Samuel worried constantly until Clara's letters arrived each week, full of tales of her studies and the work she was doing. She came home after 2 years fully trained, and she divided her time between the ranch and Wilson, providing medical care to people who couldn't afford a doctor. Thomas, at 15, was showing an aptitude for numbers and business. He talked about becoming a banker or perhaps going into law. Samuel couldn't quite wrap his head around having a son who worked with his mind instead of his hands, but he was proud nonetheless. In the spring of 1890, when Samuel was 54 and Katherine was 46, Mr. Kowalski passed away. His wife had died the year before, and their children had no interest in ranching. The Double K was sold to a consortium from back east, and Samuel worried that the new owners wouldn't honor the relationship he'd built with the old ones. But by then, Samuel's reputation as a horse trainer was solid enough that he didn't need to rely on one ranch for work. People came from all over the territory to have him work with their horses. Between that, Katherine's sewing and quilting, and the modest income from their own small herd, they were comfortable if not wealthy. Jacob and Mary had given them 3 grandchildren, by then 2 boys and a girl. Samuel found that being a grandfather suited him. He could spoil the children and play with them, then hand them back to their parents when they got cranky. He taught his grandsons to ride and told them stories about the old days, about cattle drives and outlaws, and the time he'd found their grandmother half frozen in the snow. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Samuel and Katherine returned to the spot where he'd proposed to her, the creek bank where they'd first confessed their love. It was a warm May afternoon, and the creek was running high with snowmelt. 20 years, Katherine said wonderingly. "It feels like both forever and no time at all." Samuel pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair. It was threaded with silver now, as was his own. They weren't young anymore, but they were still strong, still vital, still deeply in love. "You have any regrets?" he asked. Katherine pulled back to look at him, her dark eyes clear and steady. "Not a single one. Well, except maybe that we didn't meet sooner, so we could have had even more years together. We have plenty of years ahead of us still. I hope so. I want to see our grandchildren grow up. Maybe even great-grandchildren someday." Samuel kissed her softly. Then we'll make sure we're around for that. I've still got a promise to keep after all. Warmth forever, remember." "I remember." They renewed their vows that day, there by the creek with no witnesses except the prairie and sky. It wasn't legally necessary, but it felt right. They spoke the same words they'd spoken 20 years before in the Wilson church, and Samuel felt the same sense of rightness, of coming home. The 1890s brought change to Wyoming. What had been a territory became a state, and the wild frontier that Samuel had known as a young man was slowly being tamed. Railways cut across the prairie, and towns grew into cities. The age of the open range was ending, replaced by barbed wire and fenced pastures. But on their 20 acres with the creek running through it, Samuel and Catherine's life remained largely unchanged. They worked and loved and raised their family. They weathered droughts and blizzards, economic panics and political upheavals. They grew older together, their bodies wearing down even as their love remained constant. Clara married a doctor she'd met in Denver, a quiet man named Robert who adored her. They settled in Wilson, where they opened a practice together. Thomas did indeed go into banking, moving to Cheyenne but visiting often. All three of their children were thriving, building lives of their own while remaining close to their parents. On a cold December evening in 1896, Samuel and Katherine sat by their fire as they had hundreds of times before. Samuel was 60 now, Katherine 56. They just returned from spending the day with Jacob and Mary and their grandchildren, and they were pleasantly tired. "The children were asking about the story today," Katherine said, working on a quilt while Samuel repaired a bridle. "About how we met. They've heard that story 100 times. They never get tired of it. I think they like the romance of it, the cowboy rescuing the lady from the snow." Samuel smiled. "I don't know that it was all that romantic at the time. I was terrified I'd be too late, that you'd already be gone." "But you weren't too late. You were exactly on time." Katherine set aside her quilting and moved to sit beside him. "Sam, I've been thinking about Clara lately. My sister, I mean. I think she'd be happy with how things turned out. I think she'd be glad that her death wasn't meaningless, that it led to something good. You think about her often, more as I get older. I wonder what kind of life she would have had, what she would have become. But I also know that without her sacrifice sending me for help, even though it meant she'd die alone, I wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be here. Our children and grandchildren wouldn't exist." Samuel wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "Then we'll make sure her memory stays alive. We'll tell our grandchildren about her, make sure they know the brave woman who was their great-aunt. I'd like that." They sat together in silence, watching the flames dance. The fire crackled cheerfully, keeping the winter cold at bay. Outside, snow was falling softly, covering the world in white, but inside they were warm. "Sam," Katherine said after a while. "Yes, thank you for keeping your promise. For all these years, you've given me warmth and love and a life I never could have imagined." Samuel kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for saying yes, for taking a chance on a drifting cowboy who had nothing to offer but his heart. That was always more than enough." The new century arrived, bringing with it changes both exciting and troubling. Automobiles began appearing on the streets of larger towns, though they were still rare curiosities. The Spanish-American War came and went. The frontier that Samuel had known in his youth was well and truly gone, replaced by a more settled, civilized world. But the core of his life remained the same. Katherine was still by his side, still the center of his universe. Their children were grown and successful, their grandchildren healthy and happy. The little ranch by the creek still provided them with enough to live comfortably, and the fire in their hearth still burned every night. In the winter of 1903, Samuel was 67 years old, and beginning to feel his age in a way he never had before. His joints ached in the cold, and he moved more slowly than he once had. But he still rose each morning determined to work, to contribute, to keep the promises he'd made so many years ago. It was Katherine who finally convinced him to slow down. "We've earned our rest," she said gently. "Jacob can handle the horse training now. Let's spend our remaining years enjoying what we've built instead of always working." Samuel knew she was right. They began spending more time with their grandchildren, taking slow walks by the creek when the weather was fine, sitting by the fire and remembering the life they'd shared. They told stories about the old days, about the Wyoming territory before it was a state, about cattle drives and blizzards, and the day Samuel had found Katherine in the snow. The grandchildren never tired of that story. They would beg to hear it again and again, and Samuel would oblige, his voice growing softer and more thoughtful with each telling. It had become something of a legend in the family, the cowboy and the woman in the snow, the promise of warmth forever. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1904, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. All three of their children were there with their spouses and children. Mrs. Henderson, the pastor's wife who'd taken Katherine in all those years ago, made the trip from Wilson despite her advanced age. Even some of the old hands from the Double K days came to celebrate with them. As Samuel looked around at the crowd of people laughing and talking and celebrating, he was overwhelmed with gratitude. All of this, every person here, every relationship, every moment of joy had sprung from that single decision to stop when he saw a shape in the snow. His entire life had pivoted on that moment. Katherine found him standing alone on the porch, taking a break from the festivities. She slipped her hand into his, and they stood together looking out over their land. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how different my life would be if I'd missed you that day, if I'd taken a slightly different path or been in too much of a hurry to stop. But you didn't. You stopped. You saved me. You changed both our lives." Samuel turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. Even at 62, with silver hair and lines marking her face, she was beautiful to him. More beautiful than she'd been at 22, because now he knew every expression, every gesture, every thought behind those dark eyes. "I love you, Katherine Kincaid," he said. "I've loved you for 30 years, and I'll love you for however many more we're given." "I love you too," Katherine said, tears shining in her eyes. "Thank you for your warmth, Sam, for keeping me warm all these years." They kissed there on the porch while their family celebrated inside. Two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something lasting. The years that followed were gentler, quieter. Samuel and Katherine spent their days in simple pleasures, tending the garden, feeding the chickens, playing with great-grandchildren when they visited. Samuel could no longer work with horses the way he once had, but he could still sit on the porch and watch Jacob train the young ones, offering advice when asked. Katherine's hands grew too stiff with arthritis for detailed sewing, but she could still piece together quilts, and she made one for each grandchild and great-grandchild. She would sit by the fire in the evenings, working slowly and methodically, while Samuel read to her from the newspapers or from books ordered from catalogs. In the spring of 1908, Katherine fell ill with pneumonia. Samuel sat by her bedside for 3 days and nights, refusing to leave even to eat or sleep. He held her hand and talked to her, reminding her of their life together, begging her not to leave him. Clara, with all her medical training, did everything she could, but in the end, it was Katherine's own strength that pulled her through. She recovered slowly, and Samuel never left her side during the long weeks of convalescence. "You scared me," he admitted one evening as they sat together by the fire, Katherine wrapped in quilts despite the warm spring weather. "I thought I was going to lose you." "Not yet," Katherine said, her voice still weak but determined. "I'm not ready to leave you yet. We still have time." And they did. Katherine regained her strength, though she was never quite as robust as she'd been before. They continued their quiet life, savoring each day as the gift it was. In 1910, Wyoming was celebrating 20 years of statehood. There were festivities planned in Cheyenne and in towns throughout the state. Samuel and Katherine didn't attend, they were too old for such excitement, but they marked the occasion in their own way, remembering the territory they'd known and the state it had become. "So much has changed," Katherine said as they sat on their porch watching the sunset. "Sometimes I can hardly believe it's the same place." "Some things haven't changed," Samuel said. "The prairie is still here. The creek still runs through our land. And I still love you just as much as I did the day I married you. More, even." Katherine smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. "Some things are eternal." As the years advanced, their children took over more of the day-to-day work of maintaining the ranch. Jacob and his family essentially ran the place now, while Samuel and Katherine occupied the role of beloved elders. They were consulted on important decisions and deferred to out of respect, but the real work fell to younger, stronger hands. Samuel found he didn't mind. He'd worked hard his entire life, and now it was time to rest, to enjoy the fruits of all that labor. He and Katherine would sit together for hours, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing in comfortable silence. They'd been together so long that words weren't always necessary. On a cold January morning in 1912, Samuel woke to find Katherine still asleep beside him, which was unusual. She typically rose before him, her body clock attuned to decades of early mornings. He watched her for a moment, taking in the peaceful expression on her face, the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. "Katherine," he said softly, touching her shoulder, "it's morning." She stirred and opened her eyes, smiling when she saw him. "Good morning. I was having the most wonderful dream." "What about?" "About the day you found me in the snow. But in the dream, I wasn't afraid. I knew you were coming. I could feel you getting closer, and I knew I just had to hold on a little longer." Samuel pulled her close, feeling the familiar warmth of her body against his. Even after all these years, holding her still felt like coming home. "I'll always come for you. Even if it takes me a lifetime, I'll always find my way to you." "I know," Katherine whispered. "That's what makes the dream so beautiful, not that you found me, but that I knew you would. That I trusted completely in your promise." They lay together as the morning light grew stronger, neither wanting to break the spell of the moment. This was what their life had become, a series of perfect, simple moments strung together like beads on a string. In the summer of 1913, Samuel turned 77. His body was failing in small ways, his hearing wasn't what it used to be, his vision was growing dim, his hands shook sometimes. But his mind was still sharp, and his heart still beat strong in his chest, still filled with love for the woman who'd shared his life. Katherine was 73 and in much the same condition. They helped each other now, Samuel reading to Katherine when her eyes grew tired, Katherine helping Samuel button his shirts when his fingers wouldn't cooperate. They'd become each other's support in the most literal sense. Their children worried about them, suggested they might be more comfortable in town where there were neighbors close by and doctors readily available. But Samuel and Katherine refused to leave the ranch. This was their home, built by their own hands, kept warm by their own fire. They would stay here until the end. On a September evening, with autumn colors beginning to paint the landscape, Samuel and Katherine celebrated their 39th wedding anniversary. It was a quiet celebration, Just the two of them and the fire that Samuel still insisted on building every night, even when the weather was warm enough not to need it. 39 years, Katherine said, holding a cup of tea in her lap. Next year will be 40. Can you imagine? I can, Samuel said. I can imagine 50, 60, 100. I'll never stop being amazed that you chose me. It was the easiest choice I ever made. She set down her tea and reached for his hand. Sam, I want you to know something. If I had to do it all over again, if I could go back to that wagon crossing the frozen creek, I wouldn't change a thing. Not the accident, not Clara's death, not the cold and fear. Because it all led me to you, and you were worth everything. Samuel felt tears prick his eyes. Katherine, let me finish. You promised me warmth forever, and you've given me so much more than that. You've given me love and family and purpose. You've given me a life worth living. And when my time comes, whether that's tomorrow or 10 years from now, I'll die happy because I got to spend my life with you. Samuel pulled her close, holding her as tightly as his old arms would allow. I love you, he said, his voice breaking. More than words can say, I love you. I love you too. Forever. They sat together by the fire until it burned down to embers. Then Samuel helped Katherine to bed. They lay in the darkness, holding hands between them, and talked quietly until sleep claimed them both. Winter came to Wyoming once more, the 41st winter since Samuel had found Katherine in the snow. The weather was bitter that year, colder than it had been in decades. Samuel kept the fire burning hot, determined to keep Katherine warm and comfortable. On a January morning when the world was white with snow, Katherine woke feeling weak and disoriented. Samuel helped her drink some water and tried to get her to eat, but she had no appetite. By evening, she was running a fever, and Samuel sent word to Clara. Clara arrived within hours, and the worry on her face told Samuel everything he needed to know. His daughter had been a nurse for over 20 years. She'd seen enough death to recognize when it was coming. It's her heart, Clara said quietly, drawing Samuel aside. It's just wearing out, Papa. There's nothing I can do. How long? Samuel asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Days. Maybe a week. Samuel returned to Katherine's side and took up a vigil he would not break. Jacob and Thomas arrived with their families and the little cabin filled with people who loved her. But Katherine's focus never wavered from Samuel. Don't leave me, he whispered to her in the quiet moments when they were alone. Please, Katherine, I don't know how to be without you. You'll be fine, she said, her voice weak but certain. You're strong, Sam. You'll grieve, but you'll survive. And when your time comes, I'll be waiting for you. I'll be waiting in the warmth. 3 days later, as the sun was setting and painting the snow outside in shades of pink and gold, Katherine took her last breath. Samuel was holding her hand, and he felt the exact moment she left, felt her spirit slip away like water through his fingers. The grief that crashed over him was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It was physical, a weight pressing down on his chest until he couldn't breathe. His children held him while he sobbed, and eventually someone guided him to a chair by the fire that he'd kept burning faithfully for 40 years. They buried Katherine in the spring, when the ground had thawed enough to dig. The whole family was there, along with what seemed like half the county. She'd touched so many lives in her 74 years, had been beloved by everyone who knew her. Samuel stood at the graveside in Wilson's cemetery, not far from where Katherine Ellis had been laid to rest more than 40 years earlier. He'd had words prepared, things he wanted to say about his wife and the life they'd shared. But when the time came, he found he couldn't speak. The grief was too raw, too overwhelming. Instead, it was Jacob who spoke, telling the gathered crowd about his parents' love story. About the cowboy who found a woman freezing in the snow and promised her warmth forever. About the life they'd built together, the family they'd raised, the love that had sustained them through 4 decades of joys and sorrows. After the service, as people drifted away, Samuel remained by the grave. Clara found him there as the sun was setting. "Papa," she said gently, "we should go home." "I promised her warmth," Samuel said, staring at the fresh earth. "How can I keep that promise now? You kept it for 40 years. That's forever, Papa." "That's what forever means for as long as you both lived." Samuel looked at his daughter, seeing Katherine in her features, in her strength and compassion. "I don't know how to live without her. You do. You just don't want to yet, and that's all right. Grief takes time." Clara took his arm. "But Mama wouldn't want you to stop living. She'd want you to find joy in your grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She'd want you to sit by the fire and remember the good times, not just mourn what's lost." Samuel let his daughter lead him away, though part of his heart remained behind in that cemetery. The months that followed were the hardest of Samuel's life. He moved through his days like a ghost, going through the motions of living without really feeling alive. The cabin felt too empty, too quiet. He still built a fire every evening out of habit, but the warmth felt hollow without Katherine there to share it. His children worried about him, taking turns staying at the ranch to make sure he was eating and caring for himself. Thomas suggested Samuel might be happier moving in with one of them, but the old man refused. "This is where I belong," Samuel said. "This is where we built our life. I can't leave it." Slowly, painfully, Samuel began to heal. He would never stop missing Katherine. The ache of her absence was a constant companion, but he learned to live with it. He began to notice his surroundings again, to take pleasure in small things. A grandchild's laughter, the first flowers of spring, the sound of the creek running past his property. He spent his days sitting on the porch when the weather was fine, watching Jacob work with the horses. He told stories to anyone who would listen, keeping Katherine's memory alive through words. He worked on his own memoirs, writing down the story of their life together so future generations would know the love that had existed between them. On what would have been their 40th wedding anniversary, Samuel made the trip to Katherine's grave. He brought wildflowers he'd picked from the prairie and sat beside the headstone for a long time, talking to her as if she could hear him. "I miss you," he said. "Every day, every hour, every breath, I miss you. But I'm trying to do what you wanted. I'm trying to live, not just exist." The children are well. Jacob's oldest is getting married next month. Wish you could be there to see it. And Clara just delivered twin girls for the banker's wife, which is causing quite a stir in town. He paused, wiping at his eyes. "I kept my promise, Katherine. I gave you warmth for as long as we both lived. And when my time comes, I know you'll be waiting. I know you'll keep me warm in whatever comes next." Samuel lived for 3 more years after Katherine's death. They were peaceful years, spent surrounded by family and love. He saw great-grandchildren born, attended weddings and christenings, and remained the beloved patriarch of a large and thriving family. On a cold February night in 1917, Samuel went to bed feeling more tired than usual. Jacob checked on him before retiring, and they had a good conversation about nothing in particular. Samuel seemed in good spirits, content, and at peace. He died sometime during the night, slipping away quietly in his sleep. He was 81 years old. They found him the next morning, and Jacob said later that his father looked peaceful, even happy, as if he'd been welcomed into something warm and wonderful. They buried Samuel beside Katherine in the Wilson Cemetery on a sunny spring day. The whole family was there, spanning 4 generations: children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and even a few great-great-grandchildren. The oldest of them told the story one more time, the story that had become legend in the family. About a cowboy named Samuel Kincaid, who found a woman named Katherine Ellis freezing in the snow one bitter winter day. About how he built a fire and promised her warmth forever. About how that promise became a life, became a love, became a legacy that would endure long after both of them were gone. And in the years that followed, when winter storms swept across Wyoming and snow piled high, the descendants of Samuel and Katherine would gather around their own fires. They would tell the story to their children and grandchildren, keeping the memory alive. They would talk about the power of a promise kept, about the kind of love that endures through hardship and time. The little ranch by the creek remained in the family, passed down through the generations. The cabin was expanded and modernized, but the original hearth remained, and there was always a fire burning in it during the cold months. It became a tradition, a way of honoring Samuel's promise. "Warmth forever," they would say as they lit the fire. "That's what he promised her. And that's what we promise each other." The story of Samuel and Katherine became more than just family history. It became a touchstone, a reminder of what was possible when two people committed to each other completely. It became proof that love could flourish even in the harshest conditions, that warmth could exist even in the deepest cold. Years turned into decades, and the Wyoming territory that Samuel had known became part of history books. The Wild West was tamed, the frontier closed, the world transformed beyond anything he could have imagined. But the story endured, the love endured, and on cold winter nights when families gathered around their fires, the story would be told again, about a cowboy and a woman in the snow, about a promise made and kept, about warmth that lasted forever, because some promises transcend death. Some love stories never end, and some fires, once lit, burn eternally in the hearts of those who remember. Samuel Kincaid found Katherine Ellis sleeping in the snow on a bitter January day in 1874. He built a fire and promised her warmth forever. And for 40 years, through joy and sorrow, through hardship and plenty, through all the seasons of their lives together, he kept that promise. Their story became legend, passed down through generations, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But at its heart, it remained what it had always been, a simple tale of love found in the unlikeliest of places, nurtured through dedication and sacrifice, and sustained by the warmth two people created together. The fire Samuel built that day in the line shack saved Katherine's life. But the fire they built together in the years that followed the warmth of their love, their family, their shared life, that was what truly mattered. That was what endured. And in the end, isn't that what we all seek? Not just physical warmth, but the warmth of connection, of being known and loved completely. The warmth of a hand held through dark times, of a presence that makes everything bearable. The warmth of a promise kept, day after day, year after year, until forever becomes not just a word but a lived reality. Samuel and Katherine found that warmth together. They created it from nothing. Two strangers brought together by chance and circumstance who chose to build something lasting. Their love story was not perfect or easy. Real love never is, but it was true. It was real. It was theirs. And when their time on earth ended, when the physical warmth faded and they moved on to whatever comes next, the warmth they created remained. It lived on in their children and grandchildren, in the stories told and retold, in the lessons learned and remembered. Warmth forever. That was the promise. And in every way that mattered, it was a promise fulfilled. Not just for 40 years, but for all the years that followed, echoing down through the generations like the crackling of a fire on a cold winter night. The story of Samuel and Katherine Kincaid became a beacon for their descendants, a reminder that love, real, committed, enduring love, was possible. That promises made with the whole heart could be kept. That two people working together could create something that would outlast them both. On the ranch by the creek where it all began, where Samuel first brought Katherine after building that life-saving fire, there stands a monument. It's a simple thing, just a stone marker placed by their great-grandchildren. On it are carved the names Samuel Kincaid and Katherine Ellis Kincaid, the years of their births and deaths, and one simple line: he promised warmth forever, and he kept his word. Visitors to the ranch, especially during the cold Wyoming winters, often stand before that monument and feel something. A sense of presence, perhaps. A warmth that has nothing to do with the physical temperature. The enduring power of a love that began in the snow and burned bright for 40 years, never faltering, never failing. That's the legacy of Samuel and Katherine. Not wealth or land or material possessions, though they left those things behind as well. Their true legacy was the proof that love, real love, was worth every sacrifice. That the warmth created between two committed hearts could sustain not just those two people, but generations yet unborn. The fire Samuel built in that lined shack has long since gone out. But the fire he and Katherine built together in their hearth, in their hearts, in their lives, that fire still burns. It burns in the memories of those who knew them. It burns in the stories passed down through the family. It burns in the legacy of love and commitment they left behind. Warmth forever. That was the promise made on a bitter winter day in 1874, when a cowboy found a woman sleeping in the snow and refused to let her die. It was a promise kept through 40 years of marriage, through all the seasons and changes life brought their way. And it's a promise that continues to warm hearts more than a century later, a testament to the power of love to transcend time, circumstance, and even death itself. In the end, Samuel and Katherine's story is our story. It's the universal human longing for connection, for warmth, for someone who will keep their promises no matter what. It's proof that even in the coldest, darkest moments of life, when everything seems lost, warmth can be found, love can be found, hope can be found. All it takes is someone willing to stop, to look, to reach out their hand and say, "I promise you warmth forever." And then to spend every day of their life making good on that promise. That's what Samuel did for Katherine. That's what Katherine did for Samuel in return. And that's what their love still does for anyone who hears their story. It offers warmth, hope, and the promise that true love is not just a fairy tale, but a reality that can be built with dedication, sacrifice, and two hearts committed to keeping each other warm forever. The snow still falls in Wyoming every winter, just as it did that day in 1874. The wind still howls across the prairie, and the cold still bites with sharp teeth. But on the ranch by the creek, where Samuel and Katherine built their life together, there's always a fire burning. Always warmth waiting. Always the echo of a promise kept, warmth forever. That's what love is. That's what Samuel and Katherine proved. And that's the gift they left behind for all of us, the knowledge that even in the deepest winter, even in the darkest cold, warmth is possible. Love is possible. Forever is possible. All we have to do is be willing to build the fire and keep it burning, day after day, year after year, for as long as we both shall live. That's the lesson. That's the legacy. That's the love story of Samuel and Katherine Kincaid, the cowboy who found her sleeping in the snow, built a fire and promised warmth forever, and kept his promise.